Hey up, welcome to the Cannonall Farm podcast. With us, the Nicholson brothers farmers Rob and Dave.
We're two Yorkshire farmers who, along with our dad Roger, brother Rich and the rest of our family, have turned a farm with 2 sheds and a barn into an award-winning tourist attraction.
You've seen us on telly, live on Facebook, and now we've got our very own podcast.
Today's a special episode because we're going to talk about something really topical, something that's really close to our heart, and it's the future of the family farm in British agriculture.
Coming up.
As a family, we've been grateful to the NHS on so many occasions.
Yeah.
It's literally saved our lives. And we would want nothing more than to fund it adequately, and we really genuinely want to pay our fair share of tax. We all do. But if some of our neighbours and people went to school with and small farms are really struggling to make ends meet, and to try and land that tax bill on them at a time of crisis, it doesn't have any relevance to their ability to pay. We're joined today by our good pal Jules Hudson, who's on the sofa to talk about this really important issue. But until then, Dave, what have you been up to this week?
Well, not this week, this morning, really. I looked at my phone about 5:45 this morning, and there's all sorts of trouble. There's lorries stuck on the road. So I got up, gritted all the road, got the lorries out, and I've been gritting ever since this morning.
This is clear evidence that David does wear his underpants on the outside of his trousers. He is Superman.
I like to think so.
Anyway, I really need to get the thought of you in your underpants out of my mind. Let's give Jules a shout, get him on the sofa, and let's have a natter.
Sounds good.
We're really thrilled to have our biggest pal in television, Jules Hudson, sat on the sofa with us today to talk about a subject that's really close to our hearts, the crisis in British agriculture, the threat to the family farm. Jules.
Well, boys, lovely to see you. Sad, though, that we're getting together to talk about something which is, as you say, a crisis. And I think within the agricultural family, the agricultural community, it has been identified as a crisis. And so it will be, because the proposed changes the government are suggesting to inheritance tax and the effect that will have potentially on the longevity of the institution of the family farm are potentially catastrophic. And it's a difficult topic, isn't it? Because on one level, some will say, well, it's all about the money. They just don't want to pay tax, farmers. You and I understand that that's not the case. Farmers have always wanted to pay their way and to play their role in society. But this is potentially such a shock to the system, to the way that agriculture works and the, I suppose, the traditions upon which it's been founded. And it's a shock that's come out of nowhere. This was in no manifesto. It was, as I understand it, it was not discussed with the industry before it was announced in the budget. And so, not surprisingly, farmers are standing up and saying, well, hang on a minute, we haven't had a conversation around this yet. And now suddenly you're expecting us to step into line and find enormous, eye-watering amounts of money at that point when we would traditionally look to hand on our family business to the next generation. And it's a different sort of business. I mean, you're not producing washing machines or widgets or motor cars. You are stewards of our landscape, of our countryside as farmers. And that's a different kind of dynamic, isn't it? I mean, you'll know better than me.
I think, Jules, that the big problem is agriculture's already in crisis. It's got a profitability crisis. Yeah. And anyone who, and trust me, we diversified many moons ago because we had to stay on our farm because we loved being here so much. But anyone who can make a living only from the land is, to me, a hero. They're a warrior. They're a magician. They're already working miracles because farming is so difficult and the margins are so thin. So the problem is then to try and find, at a time of crisis, you've just probably lost a parent,
yeah,
which is devastating in itself. And then you've got a bill of many hundreds of thousands of pounds just for the privilege of carrying on. You're going to have to sell your best field, your best cows, all these things are thrown into the mix, and it's going to make the family farm, the future of the family farm, so much more precarious.
Do you think, though, we're talking about the small family farm more than these big estates? Because the big estates have probably got the land already in a tax scheme where it's already dealt with.
Already protected.
Yeah. So it's the small family farms who have just been plodding along, earning a small living, looking after the land to pass on to the grandkids and their grandkids.
Really interesting point there about profitability of farming. And there are different scales of farming, obviously. There are the enormous estates, and we can all picture what they look like. But when I think of farming, and the farmers I meet, as you do, up and down the country, it is the small family farm of a few hundred acres often that is just about making ends meet.
Yeah, I mean, these, say, 200-300 acre farms, Jules,
Yeah.
they'll be worth a few million.
Yeah, of course they will, because the average land price at the moment is around about £10,000 an acre. That's the average. In Herefordshire, where we are,
And I think,
it's 15.
Jules, if they were going to sell that farm,
Yeah.
it would be right and proper for them to pay their share of tax, wouldn't it? That's what we all do.
And they would pay tax.
But they're not looking to sell it. They're looking to carry on. They're looking to pass the stewardship of that land on to the next generation. Yeah. But the fact that they're caught in this little tax loophole means that they would have to sell some of the farm, making it even less viable and leading to its demise. And probably the land would be hoovered up by some big conglomerate. So in actual fact, the government's doing exactly the opposite to what it's trying to do by imposing the tax.
I mean, I've always believed, and partly I'm a student of military history, as you know. I've studied the First and Second World Wars extensively. When you look at the crisis in supply during those two conflicts, and we had to rely upon huge amounts of materials and food coming across the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was, for Churchill, he said, the one campaign that kept him awake from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. We are still not, 80 years on, completely self-sufficient.
Oh,
in our
we're about
food production.
50% self-sufficient,
Yeah.
Jules, that's all. We import 50% of what we eat.
But it takes a time of crisis for initiatives like, say, Dig for Victory to happen.
Yeah.
But in truth, we should be having a Dig for Victory conversation, I think, now, because we need to look at our food security, because it's integral, I believe, to our national security, as is energy, water supply, and all the rest of it. What we shouldn't be doing is coming up with initiatives that might undermine the very foundations of something which none of us can literally live without. We cannot live without our farms producing enough and good food.
So do you think the government is penalising the working family farm, and really should they be going for the massive estates?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, talking to people over the last couple of weeks, it's clear there are those who have invested in farms who aren't farmers, who've invested in them because they wanted to take advantage of those tax loopholes. That is a different issue, a completely different issue to the working family farm that you and I understand. And if you want to go after them, that's fine. They're seeking a bit of a dodge.
Yeah.
I get it. But what you don't want to do is chuck the baby out with the bathwater and tar every single farm with the same brush. And the ceiling of £1 million is being thrown around, isn't it? Anything over £1 million will come into the tax bracket, the new tax bracket. But as we've just said, you don't have to have many acres at 10 grand an acre to get to £1 million. And that's before you've considered the property that might stand upon it, and all the infrastructure that might come with a working farm. So you're going to catch anything over £1 million, which is anything that might be called a farm.
Yeah, as a family, we've been grateful to the NHS on so many occasions.
Yeah.
It's literally saved our lives. And we would want nothing more than to fund it adequately. And we really genuinely want to pay our fair share of tax. We all do. But if some of our neighbours and people went to school with and small farms are really struggling to make ends meet, and to try and land that tax bill on them at a time of crisis doesn't have any relevance to their ability to pay. That's the thing. I think tax to those that can afford it is absolutely fine. But some of these guys, they're literally scraping a living from marginal land, and it could tip them from there to there and lead to the sale of that farm and the damage to rural communities?
Well, I picture my friends and neighbours from my time when I lived in mid Wales. Spent 20 years living in the Cambrian Mountains. The farms there were in the hands of families that have had them for generations. If you look at the War Memorial in my old village of Llandovery, the names on that read like the names of the landholding around the village. You know, the margins were tight, the profits were small. You know, on a Thursday night, if I went into the pub, the conversation was always about what was the price at the market. Price of lamb at the market that day, you know, and you could tell if it was been a good day or a bad day. But there wasn't much between a good day and a bad day. Maybe a five or 10 quid a head, you know, on a lamb. I mean, a great mate of mine, he's got 1,000 acres up there, upland acres. It's beautiful.
And in theory, a rich man.
Well, in theory, a rich man, 1,000 acres. His isn't 10 grand an acre though. It's probably 1.5 to 2, 3 grand an acre, if that. It's great for grazing,
but it's still on paper, Jules, 2 or 3 million quid. That would mean he copped it according to the tax regime that's been introduced.
Yeah, now that landholding has come through 7 generations of the family. He is the 7th generation farmer. He's my age, Owen. His wife is working full time. His parents have moved out a very modest, very small farmhouse, cottage really, so they can live down in the village, make it easy for them. They can walk to the shop, etc., walk to the bus routes. They're paying to rent that, okay? That farm, even with 1,000 acres, only really sustained a family and a half, if that makes sense. So turning over maybe 100,000 a year, maybe less, depending on the year. Profit in that is probably 30,000 quid or something. I said to Owen the other day, what would happen if your father died tomorrow? He said, potentially we'd have to find £400,000. He said, we as a family, we've only just got back into the black after many, many years. I remember they had a big farm sale to try and make ends meet. He said, you know what, I'd give it up. I'd sell the lot. And for me to hear that from him, a guy who was absolutely born on that mountain, is of that mountain, cares passionately about it, knows every nook and cranny upon it, for him to say, I would give it up, Jules, I was genuinely shocked. But he said, I could not face going back into that level of debt. It's just crippling. You know, he wants to start a family, etc. And I understand that.
I think, Jules, we've got to try and get across to the people watching, the people at home, that what we're really concerned about is the people like your friend from Wales, the people that we know that simply can't afford this extra burden at a time when they're struggling and scraping just to get by. That's what we're really worried about. The fabric and future of rural England will be changed. It will be destroyed, and it will never come back. It will be lost in a generation. It will not come back.
And if you, I mean, take the example of my friend. If he were to try and sell it, who's going to buy it? Because his neighbours are probably in the same position, if not already, or maybe thinking, do we want to find the money to buy this land when actually we could find ourselves with another enormous tax bill at any point? And you end up with this, I think, rather than sort of unsettling feeling when people are kind of focusing on who's going to die.
I suppose,
you know, because that at that moment, that's when the financial dice are rolled on these family farms. It's terrible.
It needs a more nuanced solution, I think. It's such a complex issue, and it's not one size fits all. There are the people who, like you say, the rock stars who've come in and fancied having a go at being a farmer. Well, that's sort of different to your 7 generations hill farmer who really just wants to carry on for the love of the land and the fact that they've inherited it from their father and they've looked after it, and they just want to pass it on in better heart than they received it. That's as a farmer's son what you always hope to do.
Well, look, I mean, Dave, we know many farmers around the country, don't we? Not everybody who's a farmer now necessarily wanted to be a farmer. But I think as farmers' sons and farmers' daughters, you take on the responsibility that there is a legacy that you are a guardian of, a steward of. And it's not just the family business, but the family farm itself, making sure that landscape is handed on after your time in as good, if not better condition than when you got a hold of it. And there's a responsibility there that you wouldn't get from a big corporate farming industry.
Yeah, and something else that I was thinking about earlier is, if you go back a couple of years to the pandemic, you know, farmers were essential workers.
Yeah.
You know, they were classed as essential workers. Were providing food when, you know, transport was all, you know, flights had stopped. You know, there wasn't the same supplies coming into the country. You know, and we were there, you know, supplying food to the villagers and everyone around us.
I'll give you a great example of that. During the pandemic, I live about 7 miles from Hereford. There's a big Tesco on the outside of town. I'd gone down there to get some stuff. They were out of milk. And I said to the girl, okay, well, when's your milk coming back? And she said, 2 weeks. Tesco's couldn't get milk to our branch in Hereford for 2 weeks.
So did you buy a cow?
Well, I didn't need to, because a mile up the road, my local garage cum farm shop, which was supplied by our local dairy farmer, had as much milk as anybody would ever have needed. But he's now decided to pack it in. That dairy farmer's now closed because the margins on the milk were not sustainable, and he's given it up. Wasn't a big farm, probably a couple of 100 acres, 250 acres, been a dairy for generations. That's now gone. And, you know, it's just another example of the pressures that exist throughout farming and all the different sectors of farming and how low those margins are. We need to be encouraging people to stick with it, to stay in the business, to invest their lives and their time in a business without which all of us would struggle. You cannot live without food and you cannot live without farming.
I suppose we've been talking a lot about land prices, you know, what's going to have to be sold. But for me, it's the loss of the lifestyle. You know, the farming lifestyle, the community, that is the big loss to society.
And once you start breaking up farms, you'll never get them back. You know what it's like. You too, you as a family have looked down the barrel of losing a very modest farm of 130 acres when the bank were going to foreclose because you couldn't make ends meet. You spectacularly diversified, but you too particularly have absolutely seen what that looks like. And I think, you know, that's the worry, isn't it? If to meet these eye-watering bills that again have come out of nowhere, you have to start selling off the asset of the farm. The farm itself becomes smaller, it becomes less viable. That's not supporting British agriculture. It's undermining it. It's like selling off bits of your factory. You know, you can't produce what you were producing in the same way. So all you're doing then is undermining the viability. And I think that to me is what goes to the heart of this. That's what I'm hearing from our farming friends around the country. It's about keeping it viable in a really difficult, anxious financial climate, which farming's always operated in. People will see the big tractors and the combines and all the rest of it and think, oh, there must be a wash with cash. Look at all that investment that's standing on the farmyard. We know much of that stuff is probably leased. It's on HP, but you have to have it to do the job. So the margins are tiny. A friend of mine, he's a big farmer in Herefordshire, he said, if I went to the bank and I said, I want you to invest 10 million quid in this business and the return on it will be 1%, they shake me the door. But that's the kind of margins that farmers are working to. He was telling me, mate of his dad in Oxfordshire, you know, good arable, profitable land. On a good year, he might take 100 quid off an acre for cereals. That's before you've put all the machinery and investment on top of it to actually crop something. I mean, that's pretty telling, isn't it?
We knew, Jules, 35 years ago that we couldn't carry on farming conventionally. You know, we had our crisis then, and we embraced diversification. You know, we genuinely enjoy welcoming people onto the farm, showing them round, and we've loved what we've done. But I don't think that every farmer in the country should have to do what we've done. You know, there should be a role for a conscientious farmer to produce great food to the highest standard in the world. You know, that shouldn't be forgotten. The highest standard, higher than what we're importing, and still be able to make a living. Just make a modest living. That's all they ask. And farm hand in hand with nature so that birds and mammals get a fair crack of the whip. And make a small profit, enough to raise a family and pass the land on in better heart than they inherited it.
But I think what's interesting here as well is what are the prospects for those who want to become first generation farmers, for those who want to start to farm? And I meet quite a few of those around the country. You know, they may start with perhaps 50 acres here.
It's hard
maybe
enough
60
just
acres.
to carry on being a farmer, let alone set something up, isn't it?
Well, farming works at scale. unless you can walk in and buy 300 or 400 acres off the bat and know what to do and understand what you're trying to achieve as a first-time farmer, it's incredibly difficult. And again, you wouldn't want to penalise those who are prepared to take on all the risks and challenges of being a farmer, because we need more people to come into it, just as we want to sustain those who are prepared to carry on the family tradition and the multi-generational farming. So I just don't see how, from any angle, these proposals are supporting British farming. Numbers are being thrown about, we're investing this, we're investing that. That's not the point. And I think one of the things that I would urge anyone in government to consider is that, farmers are problem solvers. Farmers are talkers. There is a conversation to be had. Let's have that conversation and let's work out a solution. And you won't talk to a more proactive, constructive, listening bunch as farmers. But if you don't talk to them, you're not going to get anywhere.
The other thing I've been thinking about quite a lot is there's already a mental health crisis in agriculture, right? This is going to take it from there right up there, because there's so much to worry about. Older people especially, all they want to know is that their land is going to be passed on. It's going to be farmed in the future, hopefully by their descendants, but they've got a real feeling for the land, a real love for the land, and this is going to make them even more worried.
You two won't need to imagine this, but the prospect of somebody having spent their entire life and career carrying on that farming tradition, maintaining the farm with a view to it being passed on to the next generation, then thinking, my goodness me, those last 50, 60 years might well count for nothing, because actually we may simply not be able to afford to do it. That's an absolutely heartbreaking.
And how would you feel? You'd feel absolutely ruined.
You would. Before the event.
Yeah.
What from your point of view then, as farmers who have successfully diversified and been through this mill, quite literally, what is the solution?
I think someone needs to design a scheme, a system where we actually concentrate on producing food again, because there are a lot of schemes that are in place where there's no food involved. People need to eat. As a nation, we need to eat. But I care passionately, and I care really passionately, that mammals need to thrive, birds need to thrive, everything needs to find a place to have a great life. The standards that we farm to are really high, and that's how it should be. I do believe that's important.
But you touch on something interesting there, and it's always in the mix, isn't it, with every new government and every proposed, overriding agricultural policy. We don't want to pay farmers to not farm.
No, they need to produce food.
We've had enough of that, and every farmer I speak to says we don't want subsidies, we just want to be able to farm and get on with it. We want to be able to produce the best that we can, and we've talked about the quality of food and agriculture here in this country. We are blessed, aren't we, that we can all trust and rely upon
reward them
what
for
we're
producing great food and looking after nature. To me, it doesn't have to be any more complicated than that.
But the whole point surely should be that any government, whatever its stripe, should be looking to support an industry which is absolutely part and parcel of our national security, our food security. It's the glue that binds together our rural communities. It maintains our rural landscapes. It maintains our biodiversity. It helps us meet our climate targets as we go forward. All of that, farming is the industry that can keep giving, provided you support it.
If we reverse the clock and go back to like wartime, the small family farm had lots of varieties of birds.
Just what I was going to say, Dave. When Dad came here, what did we grow?
Well, we grew potatoes, we grew turnips, we grew everything, and wildlife was abundant, right? If the government looked after the small family farm, wildlife would be looked after, right? And the hedges would be put back. Encourage small family farms, not the 30, 40, 50, 60,000 acre farms. That's what you need to do, and that would bring, employment. It would bring sustainability and great food for the public.
And I think what worries me in particular is that if the family farm were to fail as an institution, we say goodbye to hundreds and hundreds of years of history and emotional and practical investment and knowledge. And you're not going to get that from a corporate running a big farm. You're just not going to get it. Imagine ICI running farming.
You're going to get bigger fields, less edges, less walls, more monoculture, less diversity.
Yeah.
We just need to go back to how it was when Dad bought this farm, when he first came here. There was mixed cropping. They had a small dairy herd. He had a few pigs. He had a few sheep. He had a few beef cattle. There was a bit of everything. All your eggs weren't in one basket. We need a government, to design a scheme where great food is produced, where the farmer can earn a living, and where wildlife can have a fair crack of the whip. It's not impossible. We can do it, and we need to do it.
And I think for me, that's the point. If the family farm were to disappear, you lose that knowledge, that experience, and that passion for the landscape. And I just don't think you're going to get that from a big corporate farming entity who are perhaps more interested in what their shareholders get back than what they put into that stewardship and that sense of care.
Yeah, it wouldn't be owned by somebody in the countryside. Yeah. It would be owned by shareholders in the city.
Yeah.
And
venture capital covering it in trees, saying, "Oh, we've ticked
a
carbon neutral
solar panels,
or solar panels, or whatever." I mean, I think one of the things that these conversations I'm having over these last few weeks has highlighted is that farming wants to farm more, and we're all beginning to understand in a more anxious world, where our security in all sorts of sectors is clearly at risk. Now is the time when we should be thinking about how do we accelerate and ramp up our food production to enhance our food security. And we need to do it before we get to another big international crisis. We should be thinking about it right now.
You see, Jules, we're from a town that has got a proud coal mining tradition. We've got coal miners in our lineage that go back many, many years. And we know how devastating it's been to Barnsley to lose its pits in such a sudden way. It was a real blow to the town, and it's only just recovering now. So yeah, we know the damage that can be done when an industry dies before your eyes. And if the same thing happened to agriculture as well, that would be truly heartbreaking.
It's an interesting analogy, that, with the coal mining, and I have read some reports recently which have compared this moment in our agricultural story to the miners' crisis in the 1980s. Do you think it could be that bad?
Yeah, I genuinely do, Jules. We used to have energy security, didn't we? And then we lost that because cheap Russian gas was readily available. All of a sudden, cheap Russian gas is no longer available, and we're scratching around for power. The same thing could happen to food. We need to invest in our homegrown, sustainable, quality food markets and not rely on imports all the time. Imports are great because there are certain things that we can't grow here, but we need to be solidly able to grow the staples. Otherwise, we literally could run short.
And look at the crisis that's unfolded in the Red Sea of late. We've all seen just how vulnerable shipping lines are, actually.
Who would have thought in this day and age that we could be vulnerable to pirates again?
Yeah.
I thought pirates were a thing of the past.
No. And this is the point. I think, the world is changing, not always for the better, but we have a great farming industry in this country. It can support us. It can sustain us. And we just need to ensure it's got the support that it needs to do that and encourage it to grow. They talk about growth in the economy. Let's keep growing farming, and farmers know how to grow things.
But what would happen if the family farms disappeared and it's a great big corporate carry-on? Jobs would go because it'd be streamlined. So what would happen to those little towns in the countryside? Mm-hmm. People wouldn't have the money to spend. They wouldn't have the money. The high street would close in those little market towns as well.
Your Thursks, your Labans, your Monmouth, your all these little
the knock-ons,
market towns.
The rule of unintended consequences, with this crisis is huge potentially. And I just urge, the government to engage in a conversation with the farming industry to come up with a sensible solution, because I think it's very easy for governments sometimes to think that they know it all, that they can't ever be wrong. We can all be wrong. And it's how you deal with that I think separates the good from the bad.
Jules, that feels like a really suitable place to end. thank you so much for coming. I've enjoyed the chat. It's a really complex issue, and no doubt it's one that's going to rumble on and on for a while yet.
Well, I suspect it will, lads. But yeah, it's great that we're talking about it, and hopefully a solution will come out of it.
Thank you very much.
But yeah, keep Britain farming, everybody.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cannon Hall Farm podcast.
Don't forget, this Christmas we've got Santa's magical elevator at Cannon Hall Farm. So if you want tickets, don't delay because they're nearly sold out.
Head to cannonhallfarm.co.uk to book your places now.
After we've finished here, we're going to take Jules into the elevator, see if we get him to the Christmas spirit.
Helen's calling by shortly. Shall we see if she wants to join us on a little trip to Lapland?
Sounds good to me.
Right, we better wind up here then. We'll be back next time, but until then, I've been Farmer Rob.
I've been Farmer Dave.
Bye-bye.
There's no way you're on good list.
What do you mean? I've been good all week.
Be good to me.
Yeah, well, you deserve to be on naughty step.